I was born on the island of Chios, October 22nd, 1816. In the year 1822, when Chios was taken by the Turks, I, with the remainder of my family, fell into their hands.
In 1822, the island of Chios suffered the first modern Holocaust. What took place there shocked the civilized world. Statesman Daniel Webster and Henry Clay were among many in America who condemned this action by the Ottoman Empire. In Europe, Lord Byron, Victor Hugo, and Delacroix were inspired to sympathize with the Greek cause. The shockwave resulting from the Chios massacre led to the resurrection of a free and independent Greece.
Slaves. Under barbarous masters, the Greeks have still aspired after the blessings of knowledge and civilization. Before the breaking out of the present revolution, they had established schools and colleges and libraries and the press. Wherever, as in Chios, owing to particular circumstances, the weight of oppression was mitigated, the natural vivacity of the Greeks and their aptitude for the arts were discovered.
Daniel Webster.
This beautiful island, the ancient Chios, the birthplace of Homer, situated under the delicious climate of the East, blessed with the fertile soil, teeming with the richest productions of nature, which are brought to perfection by the hand of art, was ever inhabited by a race of Greeks distinguished for their peaceful character. The island was governed in a great measure by Greek magistrates. They were exempted by particular favor from the exactions of any Turkish officer and paid a very light tribute. The consequences were soon seen. Its population increased in number, in civilization, in refinement. The face of the country was improved. It was covered with flourishing vineyards, with groves of lemon, orange, citron, and mastic. The peasantry prospered. They built neat and handsome villages, and the island soon became the most interesting one in the Levant. It is the place and residence the most agreeable I know, says an old traveler. The women are there the most refined and the most beautiful. The inhabitants acquired in some measure the manners and customs of European society. A large hospital was erected, schoolhouses were opened in every part of the island, and a college was established where the languages, ancient and modern, literature and philosophy were taught to a great number of young Greeks.
When the Greek Revolution started in 1821, Western powers, and especially England, opposed it as a threat to the integrity of the Turkish Empire. That is why the British ambassador in Constantinople warned the government of Turkey that an uprising was planned on Chios.
Viscount Strangford, British ambassador in Constantinople, to the Marquis of Londonderry, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs. Constantinople, Wednesday, April 10th, 1822. The intention of the insurgents to attack Chios had reached this embassy on the 28th of last December. Similar information had been conveyed to the French ambassador on the 14th of February, and we had severally made a confidential communication on the subject to the Porte. Our warnings were, however, slighted by this government, and the only use which it had made of them was to send a few old iron guns to Chios to assist in the defense of the citadel. Viscount Strangford, Wednesday 10th April 22. In the months of December and February last, I had on 2 separate occasions informed him and his colleagues of the intentions of the Greeks to attack Chios, and that I had specifically directed the attention of the Turkish government to that vulnerable point.
Those days, just like today, the large powers, Britain, England, and the United States, were mainly only concerned really, about maximizing their own great power interest and maximizing the profits of their merchants. And Turkey was at this time extremely important to all of them to preserve their power interest as a balance against Russia as far as Britain was concerned, because they were afraid of the rise of Russia, and also for the money that they made by trading with the Turkish Empire, which was extremely important to America, for example. They wanted stability above all. The whole policy was anti-revolutionary. Now, it should be mentioned that the rebellion was to a very minimal degree participated in by the actual people of Chios. It was a force from Samos led by Lycurgus Logothetes and Chian Borneas, who served under Napoleon, which landed in Chios and raised the standard of rebellion. A small percentage of the native population joined the rebellion, but most of them, the vast majority, did not join it.
When reports reached Constantinople that there was a rebellion on Chios, Sultan Mahmud II was inflamed with rage. He prepared severe measures in order to make an example of the island. Mahmud II was known in the West as Mahmud the Reformer because of his westernizing and modernizing reforms. But he was one of the bloodiest leaders of any country in the 19th century. His typical response to unrest was to massacre anyone opposing Ottoman rule. It was April 11, 1822, Holy Thursday, one of the most sacred days of the Christian calendar. A massive Turkish fleet of 40 ships and 20,000 men arrived off the island of Chios. They were given a mission by Sultan Mahmud II to punish the rising of the island and to punish it severely.
Christophoros Kastanis described the coming of the Turkish fleet.
It was April 11th, 1822, the dawn of Holy Thursday, a day of prayer and fasting. My mother had awakened all her children in order to attend them to the church at Latomitisa, which commanded a view in the Straits of Chios. During the service, just before sunrise, an alarm was raised by a deacon that the Ottoman Armada was in sight. Shrieks of terror followed the announcement. Many began to quit the church. The high priest commended our souls to God, dismissed us, and remained alone to burn incense and supplicate for divine mercy in our behalf.
When the Turkish fleet arrived by Chios, it quickly bombarded the main town, concentrating its fire at the rebel positions.
And the firing spread the conflagration, the fire started, and on that first day, the Turks started bombarding the town, one of the main incidents that happened was that the local Turks actually attacked the leper hospital and massacred all the lepers.
As Kastanis relates,
20 or more Turks being let loose from the tombs where they had been concealed by Catholics from the Samian rage, entered the leper hospital and slaughtered the inmates, causing a torrent of blood to roll from the threshold. Night veiled the frightful sight and silenced the siege.
And they did land on the following day, which was on Good Friday. The Turkish army and the paramilitary landed on April 12, 1822, in the town of Chios and started massacring, burning, looting, and enslaving.
One of the first institutions that suffered again was the massive Chian library, 60,000 volumes, which had been built laboriously through the donations of the wealthy class of Chios, and that was burned to the ground by the Turks. Also, they carried out a policy. The troops were ordered to kill all women over 40, all children up to 2, and all boys or males over 12. The rest of them they could enslave. Christoforos Kastanis described what happened on the second day of the Turkish arrival at Chios, Holy Saturday, 1822.
Our procession traveled over the Caucasus along the path and entered the formidable citadel within which lay the original Turk town, comprising about 1,000 families. Within its enclosure, His Cruel Highness the Pasha awaited the returning bands of marauders. His officers kept a strict account of proceedings to transmit to the Sultan and thus testify to their destructive industry. Bounty was paid for heads, and then every scribe noted down the transaction on the day book of tyranny, as was customary. To prevent deception, the ears were cut off from the heads and then pickled and barreled. They were sent to the Sultan as tokens of their obedience or as bulletins of their success. Sometimes an entire head was pickled and forwarded to the Grand Signor. Mahmud once had the queer taste to place a head on his table at a banquet or levee where Christian envoys were present. Such hellish proceedings were the chief objects which excited the indignation of Europe. Such horrors ought to call forth their deepest sympathy for the sufferers. I stood in presence of that Pasha, whose nod was sufficient to order my exit to eternity. The amount of carnage was enormous. 1,200 heads had already been noted in the tale of the bounty given for each. Swords began to issue from their scabbards with a noise like a death toll in our ears. Our sentence was given. The young men were to be executed, and the girls and boys sold. Thus, my being a mere lad saved me. Lamentations sounded at the separation of kindred. Mothers and sisters were torn from the victims, who were hurried by the executioners with business-like dispatch without the castle to be slain in the public walk. The citadel was already gory enough, and the Pasha had lost the curiosity which the novelty first afforded. The young men, seeing their tyrants inexorable, followed, obeying the command of their mothers to fall like martyrs, preferring a glorious dissolution to a disgraceful apostasy. When the victims were stationed on the public walk, each one was ordered to kneel. The martyr knelt, exclaiming, "Remember me, Lord." While he said these words, the scimitar fell upon his neck.
We're here at the Cathedral of St. Markella in Astoria, Queens, to discuss with Bishop Christodoulos the spiritual significance of the 1822 massacre at Chios.
During the early stages of the massacre of Chios in 1822, when the massacre was still in the main city of Huara, before it spread to the hinterlands and into the secondary cities and into the villages and into the small villages, in the main city of Chios, one of the Turkish, I don't know if it was an officer, I don't know if he was just a soldier, but a Turkish garrison commander went into a nearby church, took a cross from inside the altar, and put it on the ground inside near the main square of Chios town, across the moat from the Castro, across the moat from the main Turkish fort in Chios. He put the cross on the ground, and he had lined up, some say 30,000, some say 10,000, thousands, tens of thousands of men, women, and children were lined up that were going to be sent into slavery,
ordered that were going to be separated from those that were going to be slaughtered, and those that would be sent to harems, and children that would be sold into the Janissary corps, and some that would be just sold into the normal slave markets. These people were lined up to be separated into these categories. As they were lined up, they were lined up to pass the cross that was on the ground. They had a choice either to step on the cross and live, or go around it and be killed and be martyred. The Turks were so enraged by resistance, I suppose that they decided that these people were willing to sacrifice the money, that the profits that they would have made by selling these people into slavery and janissaries. So these are people that they deemed expendable for some reason, or that they were so enraged by their bloodlust that they wanted to give the people a choice of deny Christ, step on Christ, or live. Whatever their motives were, this is what they did. By all accounts, not a single person stepped on the cross. Whether it was 10,000 people or 30,000 people, the important thing is that not one person stepped on the cross. Not one man, not one woman, not one child stepped on the cross. All 30,000 of them had their heads removed by a Turk that was standing not far from the cross, waiting to see who would not step on the cross. There was a pile of 30,000 heads by the end of that day. This is a witness to the fact that Chios, at that time, was an island filled with the Holy Spirit, filled with people who were in union with Christ, or people who found it in there. If they were not living a life of extreme piety, they found Christ in the last moments of their life, as the thief on the cross did.
As soon as the Turkish fleet arrived, many of the people of the town of Chios, the main city, fled for the hills. They started hiding. Others tried to get any ship or boat that they could to be able to flee the island completely.
Several Greek ships sailed to the island of Chios, intending to pick up survivors. The scene which presented itself to the Greek sailors who landed on the southern shores of Chios was such as no pen could trace, no language could describe. The beach for several miles was strewed with the bodies of men, women, and children, many of whom were still warm and bathed in their own blood. Many of those taken on board had been wounded and looked more like specters than human beings. Mr. Hastings, a young Englishman of family who was embarked on board Tombasi's ship, witnessed these horrors and shuddered while he essayed to describe them to me at Tripolitza. An unhappy fugitive had informed my friend that he was one of 2,000 who took refuge in a cavern on the coast in the hope of concealing themselves. As, however, there was not space enough within for half the number, those who could not penetrate remained outside, many of them being obliged to stand up to their knees in water. It was while they were contending with each other to get into this imagined place of security that a party of Turks appeared on the rocks from above their heads and immediately began to fire down on them. Having thus dispatched all those who stood without, the infidels drew their atagans, rushed into the cave, and also put every soul they found to death. A French officer who landed soon after the massacre saw an infant clinging to the breast of its mother, a young and beautiful woman, whose lifeless corpse lay bleeding on the ground. This was immortalized in the painting by Delacroix. Captain Pasha neglected no means to lull the inhabitants into a fatal security by solemn promises of forgiveness of their faults and mercy and protection if they would return each one to his home and resume his occupation. Many did so, relying on the faith of the consuls of England and France, who came clad in their respective uniforms and urged the Chiots to throw themselves on the clemency of the Captain Pasha. Convinced by this, many returned to the town, and about 1,000 of the peasantry, openly separating themselves from the insurgents, retired to the monastery of St. Minas. The fourth day, the preparations of the Captain Pasha being completed, he ordered the Greeks who were in the monastery to be brought and butchered one by one. This was the signal for the commencement of that tragedy of which modern history offers no parallel. The Turkish troops gathered around the town, rushed in among the defenseless inhabitants, and began to butcher all they found. For hours, every street resounded with the yells of the assailants, the shrieks of the women and children, and the groans of the wounded and dying. The shops were pillaged, the houses burst into and ransacked, the churches profaned and demolished. And a few hours were sufficient for all this. A few hours of rapine and murder had changed the beautiful town to a scene of utter devastation. Samuel Gridley Howe. Such was the state of the beautiful Chios for 7 days. The only exception made during the massacre was in the favor of the women and boys who were preserved to be sold as slaves. Many of the former were running to and fro, half frantic, with torn garments and disheveled hair, pressing their trembling infants to their breasts and seeking death as a preservation from the greater calamities that awaited them. The carnage then ceased for a time, and those wretches who had been reserved for sale were driven to the town, where more than 10,000 women and children were collected. The boys were circumcised in order to fit them to become Muslim, and the whole embarked on board the fleet to be conveyed to Constantinople.
Many years later, George Kavakaresis remembered his family's tragedies during this period.
Mother, Maruko, Angaru, and myself were made prisoners. Next day, grandmother came to see us, and here again was a scene which my pen would in vain attempt to describe. Now, parent and child met after having gone through almost every horror that is possible for the mind to conceive. Driven from their homes, husbands and brothers butchered before their eyes, sisters and children dragged into slavery, and sharing similar fate themselves. At sunset, she returned to the consulate, but came to see us again the next day. This second visit, however, gave great umbrage to the Turks, and ultimately subjected her to a treatment far more cruel and painful than any she had yet experienced. The fiends beat her first with their fists, and then with their naked swords. My mother, sister, and myself, with streaming eyes and on our knees, supplicated them to spare the poor old lady. But our entreaties made no impression whatever on the ruffians. They continued to beat her until she could no longer stand. Then they seized her by the hair and dragged her out into the street. She recovered her strength sufficiently afterwards to be able to reach the consulate, where she received medical attention, but her wounds were past all cure. And in a few days she closed a life which perhaps was not worth having.
I was called to witness another distressing scene, the departure of my mother and sister into Asia.
Dear boy, tomorrow your sister and myself will be obliged to leave here to go to the home of the Turk in whose hands fate has placed us. Study to be a good boy after I am gone, for those among whom you are now thrown will not be as indulgent to your faults as your father and myself have been. And do also, dear boy, remember to say your prayers daily. The Bible is full of instances of God's goodness toward those who have remembered to pray to Him in the hour of adversity. And if we imitate them in this good work, we can also hope of becoming recipients of His favors.
On the following day, she again called me to her, told me that she was going, embraced me in the most affectionate manner, and together with my little sister, bid me adieu.
A few days after the landing, The Turks spread out from the main cities, fanned out to most of Chios to hunt down the Greeks who had escaped and those who lived in those areas. And their whole concept was based on, as we described, the enslavement of those who they felt could be suitable slaves and the executions and beheading of those who were not. And the only exception that they made were the mastic areas. The mastic areas were off limits because of the huge profitability of the mastic areas to the Turkish Empire. The revenues of the mastic areas belonged to the sister of Sultan Mahmud II, and she received an amount equivalent to tens of millions of dollars today every year from the profits of the mastic areas. And the Turkish army was ordered to leave the mastic villages, some 24 villages, to leave them alone.
The next target was Neamoni, which was an ancient monastery dating back to the 11th century. It was built by Constantine Monomachos, the Emperor of Constantinople. This was where 3 local hermits, John, Joseph, and Nikitas, saw an icon which was in a burning bush. The bush was burning and the icon was not consumed.
The monastery church was built on that site. This is considered one of the greatest surviving examples of Byzantine architecture and art. Neamoni has incredible religious mosaics and frescoes. When Turks came in, they massacred or enslaved the entire 2,000 refugees who were hiding in that monastery, and they attempted to burn down the church. They actually defaced the icons and really destroyed everything that they could at this particular time. The mortal remains of many of the martyrs of Neamoni, showing marks of violent deaths, are still preserved and honored at the monastery. About April 20th, the Turks reached Anabatus, which is an ancient medieval town located in the mountains about 20 miles away from the city of Chios. It is a fortified position on a high cliff with several churches. There were between 1,000 and 2,000 refugees gathered there. Included among the refugees were Lycurgus Logothetes and about 50 of his Samians who were fleeing from the Turks. The Turks attacked, and amazingly enough, even though there were only between 50 and 100 able-bodied men, there were at least about 1,500 Turkish troops. The defenders did throw back the Turkish attack and defeat the Turkish attack at first. However, on the following day, Lycurgus Logothetes and the Samians left. They went and got on a boat to go back to Samos. They disregarded their local leaders who begged them to either remain or give them guns so they could fight the Turks. And they totally disregarded that. They went into the ships and they left them to their fate. And their fate was a terrible fate. Turks got into the town, destroyed everything that they could, and many of the young women jumped off the cliff rather than be captured by the Turks. They knew they would most probably not be killed, but they knew about the enslavement policy, that they would become slaves for the harem, for prostitution, and rather than have that fate become them, they killed themselves in substantial numbers. As soon as the Turks had warning that an uprising might be planned on Chios, they took strong action. They took about 70 Christian hostages, led by Metropolitan Plato, the leading bishop of Chios, and they kept them there as hostages for the good behavior, in other words, non-revolutionary behavior of the Chian population. And in fact, Metropolitan Plato urged the Chian people not to join the Samians and to stay together with the Ottoman Empire, because he felt that
only disaster could follow a revolt by the Chians. April 23rd, actually, almost all the hostages were publicly hanged in Chios City. And this was a lesson for the population by the Sultan's government.
Archbishop Plato was a man of courage, a man of faith, a man who had enough courage of his convictions in the sense that he was not so much concerned with this life, but he was concerned with the souls of Chians, and he knew that by partaking in a violent uprising, it would do no good to the island of Chios. Better for the Chians to suffer the indignity of being second-class citizens under the Muslim yoke, better for them to suffer indignity and humility and humiliation, rather than to partake in a violent revolt. We will suffer from the world. We will suffer from the world because we are Christians. But Christ said not to fear this, because Christ said, I have overcome the world. You will suffer because of my name. You will suffer because you are my followers, he said. But do not despair, he said, because I have overcome the world. And Archbishop Plato was the first to go. The Greek Orthodox hierarchy, the Greek Orthodox clergy, they were to become the replacements of the emperors and the nobility of the former Roman Byzantine Empire. These would be the first ones to be selected whenever there would be an uprising of the Greek Orthodox Roman citizenry. Whenever they would rebel, the first ones that the Turks would come for would be the hierarchs.
Hostages were also taken in other areas. In Constantinople itself, the Sultan ordered leading Chians, at least 10 of the leading Chians, to be held as hostages. And he had them beheaded in Constantinople, hanged, in some cases even impaled. In Smyrna also, leading Chian merchants and individuals were hunted down, and some of them were even put in ovens and baked alive, and others were impaled and beheaded. So there was like a Chian hunt in different parts of the Ottoman Empire through the several weeks and months following the initial arrival of the Turkish fleet. The next phase starts on the night of June 18 into June 19 of 1822. And this was the night of the Turkish feast of Bayram, which is a major Muslim feast ending the month of Ramadan, which is called the Holy Month. And there was a celebration going on that night in the Turkish fleet, in the flagship of the Admiral Kara Ali. There was a major celebration going on. Everybody was celebrating not only Bayram, but also the great victory in Chios, in destroying the revolution. And of course, they were also very happy about all the money and the slaves that they managed to capture at this particular time. And because many of the Turks became very, very wealthy. Chios was one of the wealthiest parts of the Ottoman Empire, and it had been totally devastated and looted except for the monastic villages. 2 Greek ships stealthily came into the Turkish fleet, in the midst of the Turkish fleet. They were commanded by Admiral Constantine Canaris. Obviously, the Turks were not watching very closely. They felt very safe, and that's why the ships managed to get so close. Admiral Canaris managed to bring his ship right next to the flagship of Kara Ali. And in fact, these 2 Greek ships were fire ships. And once Canaris got really close, he and his men got off, only a handful of men anyway, from each of those ships, and in small boats, and managed to set the larger ship afire right next to the flagship of Kara Ali. The flagship blew up. It blew up, and not only that flagship blew up, but several of the other Turkish ships also blew up nearby. And the explosion started coming, the cannon of the flagship started firing at the other ships around. They were automatically set, the fire set off the cannon,
And the fort of the citadel actually fired at the flagship and some of the other ships to sink it so that they wouldn't destroy the rest of the Turkish fleet, which had been pretty closely packed together. It was all vulnerable to destruction. The admiral managed to get off in a small boat, but in the succeeding explosion, his flagship, a piece of the ship, the wood of the ship, flew and hit him, and he was killed. This particular occasion was celebrated in Greece. About 2,000 Turkish troops and sailors were killed by Canaries. There wasn't one military Greek casualty, though there were undoubtedly a certain number of Chian slaves on the flagship as well who must have died. Well, the Turks were totally incensed by this. And now, and not only in Chios, but also in Smyrna as well, they were incensed in other areas. And there were, in Smyrna, they started killing other Greeks now in Chians for a while. And they decided to drop the policy of sparing the mastic villages. They went into the mastic villages, started burning down the mastic villages, destroying everything, looting everything, killing or enslaving all the villagers. And this was the second phase of the massacre, which lasted about a week before Chios was almost totally depopulated of its Greek population. And over 40,000 were enslaved. And of those who were enslaved, they were sold in slave markets all over Constantinople, Palestine, North Africa. For a long time, Chian slaves were very cheap and easy to purchase.
The official history of the USS Constitution, published at Annapolis, the United States Naval Academy, states that between 80 and 90,000 Greeks died in the massacres of Chios in 1822.
That night of June 19th, when the flagship of Karali was blown up by Canaries, the USS Constitution and several other American ships happened to be in the area, and they witnessed the Turkish flagship being blown up.
Remarks on board the U.S. frigate Constitution, Thursday, June 20th, 1822. On the preceding night, the Greekish fleet had dispatched 2 fire ships with a vow to destroy the Turkish fleet, and they succeeded in destroying the admiral's ship of 74 guns, having 2,000 men on board. The next morning, after this affair, we observed the wreck and dead bodies floating past us.
A few years later, while the Greek Revolution was still continuing, the Constitution returned to the area. The American ship took aboard a little Greek boy whose name was George Syrian. He had been placed in a small boat by his mother in order to escape still another Turkish massacre in the Chios district. The Constitution's officers and men adopted the boy and took care of him. George Syrian enlisted in the United States Navy at the age of 9 and distinguished himself as a naval officer and an instructor in gunnery at the United States Naval Academy.
The reason the Constitution American ships were there is very interesting, and it has a lot to do in relation to American official policy towards Greece. The ships were there to protect American merchants who were heavily involved in the drug trade. Some of the greatest American families had their wealth to a large degree based on the drug trade. What they did was they would go to Smyrna, Turkey, and buy Turkish opium, which was extremely cheap. You can buy it for $2 a pound. And they would take this opium mainly to China and sell it in China for astronomical profits. Profits could be anywhere between 300% and 600%. So one of the first at this particular time was John Cushing, a Parkinson company who made a fortune in 1812.
This is Hever Castle in England. It was acquired as a residence for the British branch of the Astors. John Jacob Astor, the founder of the family's fortune, made much of his money by sending his ships from America to Turkey to buy opium, which he sold in China and elsewhere.
For the American government, business interests were predominant. Don't forget that much of this period, the Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams, who was from Massachusetts, and the main single section of the merchant community that traded from Turkey was from Boston and other areas in New England. So they had a very influential voice, and he managed to keep America away from friendship with Greece, and actually made sure that America would be closer and closer to Turkey.
British Reverend Leeds came to Chios for a visit.
The Right Reverend Leeds, to the British Missionary Society, melancholy and utter desolation has befallen this once beautiful and flourishing island. I could not have conceived, without being an eyewitness, that destruction could have been rendered so complete. We walked through the town, which was once handsome and built entirely of stone, and found the houses, the churches, the hospitals, the extensive college, where a few months ago 600 or 700 youths were receiving their education, one entire mass of ruins. On every side were strewn fragments of half-burnt books, manuscripts, clothes, and furniture, and what was most shocking to the feelings, numerous bodies were mouldering on the spot where they fell. Nothing that had life was to be seen but a few miserable, half-starved dogs and cats. The villages have shared the same fate, and of a population of 130,000 Greeks, there remain perhaps 800 or 1,000 individuals scattered through the most distant places.
What happened in Chios shocked the conscience of the Western world.
A sea change started in European attitudes towards the Greek Revolution.
The British foreign minister received much criticism in Parliament because of the Chios massacre. The observations of Sir James Mackintosh on this occasion are well worthy of historical record. He also asked whether it was mentioned in any of the recent dispatches received by the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs that the markets of Smyrna and Constantinople were filled with amiable Greek ladies and children offered to the caprices of barbarous Mohammedan voluptuaries. And finally, whether ministers could afford the nation any account of the new slave trade established in the East for the sale of amiable and accomplished Christian females.
British Foreign Secretary, the Marquis of Londonderry, was outraged at the Turkish atrocities against the Chian people.
Marquis of Londonderry, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs to Viscount Strangford, British Ambassador in Constantinople. My Lord, His Excellency's dispatches, which convey the painful and disgusting recital of the bloody scenes growing out of the Chios War, which have been acted both within that island and in the capital of the Ottoman dominions, have been received and laid before the king. In the most pointed terms to the Turkish government, the grief which His Majesty has perused these afflicting details.
In August of 1822, British Foreign Secretary, the Marquis of Londonderry, committed suicide by slitting his own throat. It was known that he was deeply depressed by the massacre at Chios and might have been feeling guilty about provoking the Turkish reaction on the island. News of Chios' tragedy caused a profound revulsion in America. Many of the American people now had a great sympathy for Chians and the Greek people in general. There was a revolution against official U.S. government policy on Greece. Boston was a center of sentiment favoring Greece. Public meetings in which women played a leading role ardently stressed the tragedy of Chios as a reason for helping the Greek cause.
We confidently call upon the citizens of Boston and our brethren generally throughout the state to join in the efforts already made and making in the civilized world for the relief of an oppressed, suffering, agonizing Christian people. We would invite the matrons of America, wives and mothers, to contemplate and to realize the picture of the fate of Chios and to use their influence in exciting a general and powerful emotion in behalf of the sufferers in a war like this. And while they draw around the firesides and miss no member from his happy place in the circle there, to think of the mothers and the daughters bred up like themselves in ease and competence in the garden of the Levant, sold in the open market, driven with ropes about their necks into Turkish transports, and doomed to the indignities of Assyrian or an Algerian slavery.
In 1824, the halls of the United States Congress were the scene of an impassioned debate on the tragedy of Chios and the Greek Revolution. Daniel Webster, who later became a three-time United States Secretary of State, proposed enabling legislation to send an official U.S. representative to the Greek revolutionaries.
This free form of government, this popular assembly, the common council held for the common good, where have we contemplated its earliest models? This practice of free debate and public discussion, the contest of mind with mind, and that popular eloquence which, if it were now here, on a subject like this, would move the stones of the Capitol. Whose was the language in which all these were first exhibited? Even the edifice in which we assemble, these proportioned columns, this ornamental architecture, all remind us that Greece has existed, and that we, like the rest of mankind, are greatly her debtors.
Young Congressman Henry Clay, who was later to become a great American statesman, rose to support the resolution of Daniel Webster.
Has it come to this? Are we so humble, so low, so despicable that we dare not express our sympathy for suffering Greece, lest peradventure we might offend someone? I would rather adjure the nation to remember that it contains 1 million free men capable of bearing arms and ready to exhaust their last drop of blood and their last cent in defending their country, its institutions, and its liberty.
The venerable patriarch of the Grecian church was massacred and hung up on the door of his own cathedral. And this was followed by an universal massacre of the Greeks at Constantinople and of the hostages throughout the empire. Amid this work of desolation, the mind has hardly the courage to dwell upon a single instance. But there is something of a peculiar horror in the affair of Chios that compels me to bring it to your recollection. If on earth there was a people worthy of the protection of heaven, it was the unoffending inhabitants of Chios. Yet this sacred island was delivered up without a crime charged upon its inhabitants, but that the blood of Leonidas and Socrates ran in their veins to murder and rape, conflagration and plunder. The sex that escaped the sword was reserved for pollution, and the devastation only ceased when there was nothing left to destroy. The island became a desert. Humanity shudders at such a recital. Atrocities like these, sir, would at any other time have roused the nations of Europe to vengeance. And yet there are men and nations who have heard it without emotion. Where, sir, is the gallantry? Where the humanity? Where the chivalry of continental Europe?
Support for Greece was tremendously energized in the United States as a result of the congressional debates. Julia Ward Howe, the writer of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, wrote of the subsequent efforts of her husband Samuel Gridley Howe, on the behalf of Greece.
After some years of gallant service, in which he shared all the privations of the little army, accustoming himself to the bivouac by night, to hunger, hard fare, and constant fighting by day, he became convinced that the Greeks were in danger of being reduced to submission by absolute starvation. He therefore returned to America and there preached so effectual a crusade in behalf of the Greeks that a considerable sum of money was contributed for their relief. These funds were expended by Dr. Howe in shiploads of clothing and provisions, of which he himself superintended the distribution.
William Cullen Bryant wrote a poem on the Chios Massacre. The Massacre at Chios by William Cullen Bryant. Weep not for Chios, children slain, their blood by Turkish falchions shed. Sends not its cry to heaven in vain for vengeance on the murderer's head. Though high the warm red torrent ran between the flames that lit the sky, yet for each drop an armored man shall rise to free the land or die. Webster's speech on behalf of his resolution was reprinted in many Latin American and European countries. It became one of the most famous speeches of its time and helped make the tragic destiny of Chios known in several continents. The oration was particularly well received in England, where it sparked more support for Greece.
To a very great degree, because of the horror aroused by the reports of the Chios massacre, many hundreds of men from Europe and the United States volunteered to fight in the Greek Revolution. These volunteers were collectively known as the Philhellenes. Lord Byron was an international idol. He was the most famous of all the Philhellenes. In the year following the Chios massacre, he went to revolutionary Greece and raised a regiment of troops to fight for Greek liberty.
He actually paid for the rising of a whole brigade of troops to fight against the Turks. Lord Byron died there the following year of disease, and his example inflamed Europe because he was the idol of so many of the cultured and young people.
The French Philhellenes included many of the greatest lights of their nation's artistic and intellectual elite. What happened at Chios was one of their major inspirations. Delacroix became obsessed with completing his masterpiece on the massacre at Chios. Monday, 12 January 1824. Have been working on the massacre at Chios for a month.
Delacroix painting of the massacres of Chios, which came out in 1824, galvanized Europe. It was bought by the French king and hung in the Louvre.
Victor Hugo was deeply moved by reports of the Chios massacre and Delacroix's masterful rendition of it. The child, Victor Hugo. The Turks have passed here, destruction everywhere. Chios, the Isle of Vines, lies black and bare. Chios, in the leaves' shade, whose seas used to reflect its wooden heights, its slopes and villas, and sometimes at night, the girls who danced and played. Deserted. No, beside the blackened stone, a blue-eyed child, a Greek child, sits alone and bows his downcast head. His only stronghold and security is a white hawthorn, a bloom equally ignored among the dead.
And the Greek Revolution, which before the massacre of Chios was really not doing very well. All of a sudden, the massacre gave the Greek Revolution a spurt of support and energizing, and brought them so much foreign help that it received a whole new life. And the Western powers, for the first time, felt forced against their will to limit the future atrocities by the Turks against the Greeks. And what happened afterwards was that whatever the Turks did was questioned by the Western powers. And in 1825, there was a report of the Barbarization Project, so-called, and that came from the Russian government and also from several British officials. They found there was a report that there was a secret Turkish plan to remove all the Greeks from conquered areas conquered by Ibrahim Pasha, who was the son of the Viceroy of Egypt, Mehmed Ali, and he had been conquering vast areas, mainly in the Morea Peloponnese, but he was planning on spreading. And the plan was to remove all the Greeks and enslave or kill all the Greeks from these areas and replace them with Muslims, mainly from Egypt, but also possibly from other areas like Albanian Muslims and so on. And this report was made credible by the fact of the massacre in Chios. The massacre of Chios made it believable that Turks would do such a thing, and the British and the French and the Austrians actually started gathering a navy, a naval force, which would go to the Turks and would tell them, you better not do something like this, or we will act against you. And in fact, in 1827, in October of 1827, there was the Battle of Navarino, where the Turkish fleet was totally crushed by an Allied fleet led by a British admiral and defeated. And that was the end of any Turkish hopes to conquer the Greeks and to reunite the rebellious Greek areas into the Ottoman Empire. And as a result of that, within a few years, 1830, the Allies decided to recognize an independent Greece, which at this particular time was really less than half of what it is now, because many Greek areas were allowed to remain with the Ottoman Empire. Chios continued to recover through the years. The Turks did grant a certain amount of autonomy to Chios, but this autonomy wasn't enough to allow them to really rebuild what was lost, because what was lost was irreplaceable. And even up to now, the library was, many of those volumes had never been replaced. Some of them were ancient volumes going back to Roman times, and they could not be replaced. The mastic villages produce mastic right now, but mastic is not as great a source of wealth as it was then. So the people of Chios have yet to recover from the massacre.
In 1828, Chios almost obtained its freedom through the efforts of Colonel Fabrier, a French Philhellene. He had been profoundly affected by the massacre of 1822 and was consumed with a desire to aid the people who had suffered so immensely. During that year, he led an expeditionary force of Greeks and Philhellenes to the island in an attempt to win its freedom. He was backed by a Greek fleet which blockaded Chios to prevent the arrival of Turkish reinforcements. Fabrier was on the road to victory when, under British pressure, he and the Greeks were forced to evacuate the island. Chios remained under Turkey for the rest of the century. On November 11th, 1912, a Greek naval squadron landed a regiment under Colonel Della Grammatica at Chios. Sharp conflicts with the Turkish garrison followed. Before the end of the next month, with Chian help, Turkey's forces had been soundly defeated and surrendered. Chios was free and effectively a part of Greece. The late date of the liberation of Chios was part of the immeasurable sacrifice in blood and suffering that the Chians made for Greek freedom. This was recognized almost a century earlier when revolutionary Greek President Kapodistrias said that all of Greece owes a great debt to the people of Chios. The remembrance of many of the martyred Chians is inspiringly memorialized on the island. Through their sacrifices, they gave magnificent testimony to their Christian faith and helped make possible the resurrection of an independent Greece.
All the atrocities that were committed by any peoples against the Orthodox Christians of the Greek-speaking world, today, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, they're to be forgiven. The church forgives them. The church asks all of her children to forgive them. To forgive them. To forgive them.